Welcome to this screencast from Access Anatomy at the University of Leeds that's going to detail various features of the peritoneum. So first of all, let's draw out the posterior abdominal wall. So this black line represents the posterior abdominal wall. Now we need to look at a couple of different types of organs that are known as retroperitoneal and organs that are known as being intraperitoneal. So let's draw out a representative organ here that's going to be intraperitoneal. So let's say this is the jejunum. And let's have a retroperitoneal organ that is anchored to the posterior abdominal wall. And let's say this is a kidney. So running along the posterior abdominal wall is going to be a layer of peritoneum. So here in red we can see our layer of peritoneum running along the posterior abdominal wall. Now if this organ is going to be intraperitoneal, it means it's going to be suspended within the peritoneal cavity, and it's going to be suspended via a double layer of peritoneum that is known as a mesentery. So here we can see a layer of parietal peritoneum, so the peritoneum that's lining the body wall is reflected from the posterior abdominal wall to form a mesentery. So here we can see a mesentery. If it's going to go on to suspend the small intestine, it's known as the mesentery. If it suspends the transverse colon or the sigmoid colon, it's known as a mesocolon, so the transverse mesocolon or the sigmoid colon. You also have mesenteries that suspend the stomach, and these are also double layers of peritoneum, and they're called ommenta, so the lesser and the greater omentums. We'll look at those later on. So here we can see a layer of parietal peritoneum that's been reflected to form this double layer, a mesentery, that then goes towards this suspended organ, and it completely envelopes this organ. We now say that this organ is intraperitoneal. It's completely surrounded by a layer of peritoneum. And as this layer of peritoneum is in contact with this organ, we call this visceral peritoneum. So peritoneum that's in contact with an organ is known as visceral peritoneum. Peritoneum in contact with the posterior abdominal wall or the anterior abdominal wall, but in this case the posterior abdominal wall, is parietal peritoneum. Parietal peritoneum has been reflected to form this double layer, a mesentery, that completely envelopes the organ, thereby suspending it within the peritoneal cavity. Now, not all organs are suspended in the peritoneal cavity, as we can see here with the kidney. And the kidney essentially just lies behind the peritoneum against the posterior abdominal wall. So here we can see a layer of parietal peritoneum is just covering this organ, but it's not forming a mesentery. So this organ that's behind the peritoneum is known as being retroperitoneal. We have other organs that are retroperitoneal, but these, like the duodenum and the ascending or the descending colon, originally had a mesentery. So again, here we've got the posterior abdominal wall. And if we just look at, say, the ascending colon, then as you're aware, the entire length of the gastrointestinal tract was suspended via the dorsal mesentery. So let's draw in this dorsal mesentery. So originally, the entire GI tract was suspended via the dorsal mesentery. So here we can just have the dorsal mesentery. But as the small intestines elongated in length and got bigger and bigger, they pushed various parts of the gastrointestinal tract to the sides. So the ascending colon and the descending colon and the duodenum were pushed against the posterior abdominal wall. So if we just follow this, we can see that this portion of ascending colon is going towards the posterior abdominal wall. As the small intestine got bigger and bigger, it elongated. It effectively pushed the ascending and descending colon and the duodenum towards the posterior abdominal wall. So what effect did this have on the mesentery? Well, it retained its mesentery as it was being pushed to the posterior abdominal wall. But as hopefully you can appreciate, as the ascending or descending colon and duodenum got pushed to the posterior abdominal wall, the mesentery actually laid alongside the parietal peritoneum of the posterior abdominal wall. So here we can see as the ascending colon is collapsing, so the mesentery is going to lay against the posterior abdominal wall. And this creates an organ that is known as being secondarily retroperitoneal. Secondarily retroperitoneal as it originally had a mesentery and was intraperitoneal. So now this organ is known as being secondarily retroperitoneal. Ascending colon, descending colon, and the duodenum are examples of this. So what I want to do now is move on to look at the greater sac and the lesser sac. So to do this, we need to look at the image which is on the screen, which is of a sagittal section through the abdominal cavity. So here we have the anterior aspect. Here we have the posterior aspect. So here we have the anterior abdominal wall, the posterior abdominal wall. Here we have the diaphragm. We've got various organs drawn in: the liver, the stomach, the pancreas, duodenum, transverse colon. We've got a part of the small intestines, let's say the jejunum, and we've got the bladder and the rectum here. So let's start off by drawing in a layer of parietal peritoneum that's running along the anterior abdominal wall. So here we've got a layer of parietal peritoneum running along the anterior abdominal wall. It then goes over the superior surface of the bladder, forms a pouch between the bladder and the rectum in the male, and it'd form a pouch between the bladder and the uterus and the rectum in the female. We'll look at these pouches when we go on to the pelvis and perineum later on in a further screencast. And then the peritoneum runs towards the posterior abdominal wall. Coming from the posterior abdominal wall, we're going to find we have a double layer of peritoneum, the mesentery, that is going to suspend the small intestines within the peritoneal cavity. So here we have a piece of jejunum suspended via this double layer of peritoneum, which is the mesentery. And we then have this layer of peritoneum running along the posterior abdominal wall. It lies anterior to the duodenum and then anterior to the pancreas. So here we can see this layer of peritoneum that's essentially lining the abdominopelvic cavity. At various points there's some reflections, so here it's forming the mesentery that's suspending the small intestine. If we follow this up towards the diaphragm, we can see it's lining the underside of the diaphragm. It then runs towards the liver, and then we have visceral peritoneum running along the diaphragmatic surface of the liver and then going under onto this visceral surface. So here we have this reflection of peritoneum from the liver, and this is known as our coronary ligament, our anterior coronary ligament. The peritoneum, this piece of visceral peritoneum, is then reflected from the liver and heads towards the lesser curvature of the stomach. And this is forming one of the layers of the lesser omentum. We'll come back to the lesser omentum in a moment. This layer then runs over the stomach, where it then leaves the stomach and goes and forms the greater omentum. Remember, the greater omentum has got this anterior layer here, which then doubles back on itself and forms this posterior layer that runs over the surface of the transverse colon. So we can see it running over the surface of the transverse colon here. And it then heads towards the pancreas. It heads towards the pancreas and it then reflects back to form the transverse mesocolon. So here we can see on the anterior surface of the pancreas, we have the root of the transverse mesocolon. The transverse mesocolon is going to suspend the transverse colon, and here we can see this layer of peritoneum completely enveloping the transverse colon. So what we can see is various pieces of peritoneum that have been reflected from the anterior or posterior abdominal wall from organ to suspend various organs within the peritoneal cavity. And what we've created by this completely enclosed space is the greater sac. So here we can see all within the boundary of this green line is the greater sac. We now need to look at the formation of the lesser sac. So to do this, we can start on the surface of the liver again. So again, we have a layer of peritoneum on the surface of the liver. It's reflected to the diaphragm, and it then runs back along the diaphragm. What we've created here is the posterior coronary ligament. And here we can see this layer of peritoneum is now running over the pancreas. And it then joins to this layer of peritoneum that was coming from the greater omentum towards the posterior abdominal wall. It runs alongside this layer and then runs along the inside of the posterior and anterior layers of the greater omentum. So here we can see it's running along the anterior layer, along the inside surface of the anterior layer, and it's approaching the greater curvature of the stomach. It's then going to run along the greater curvature of the stomach, run posterior under the posterior surface, and then it runs towards the lesser curvature, where it joins the lesser omentum to form this double layer, which then runs along the visceral surface of the liver. And what we've created now is this lesser sac, or a mental bursa. Greater sac and a lesser sac. The lesser sac can also be known as the omental bursa. And the omental bursa has both a superior and an inferior recess. The inferior recess passes down in between the layers of the greater omentum. So the inferior recess is going to pass down in this direction. And here we can see the superior recess. So the superior recess and the inferior recess of the omental bursa. We just need to name these various ligaments and various pieces of mesentery that I've identified. So if we look here, we've got the mesentery. So the mesentery is suspending the small intestines. Here we've got the transverse mesocolon. Transverse mesocolon. Here and here we have the anterior and posterior coronary ligaments. Coronary ligaments. Here we have the lesser omentum. Now the lesser omentum is going to be split into the hepatoduodenal and the hepatogastric ligaments, running from the liver to the first part of the duodenum, which we can't see here, and the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach. And then we've got the greater omentum. The greater omentum that's running from the greater curvature of the stomach, it's then doubled back on itself to run over the transverse colon. Importantly, we can then see that if we were to draw a section across the abdominal cavity in between the stomach and the transverse colon, you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of peritoneum. If we're inferior to the transverse colon, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of peritoneum. Now in life, these layers will fuse together. So this really, the inferior recess, is really just a potential space, as the greater omentum will fuse. But we do have these 4 individual layers, and it's important you appreciate how they come to form these various ligaments and mesenteries.